Final announcement. Our next speaker is the chair of Stop the War and the vice chair of CND. For those interested in how we can spend money on people and not war, there's a North London Stop the War forum at 6:30 p.m. down the road at Haringey Kurdish Community Centre on Wednesday, 8th of April, and there's leaflets available that look like this for that. Our final speaker, once again, I think won't need introduction to any of you. He's not just the MP for Islington North, but I think in many ways the MP for all of us who campaign for peace and against injustice, Jeremy Corbyn.
Thanks, Matt. The good news is I'm the last speaker, okay, so you can all get to go home after that, so I'll be as brief as I can. I've actually had a very good day. I haven't been here, unfortunately, but I've managed to have a good day without being here. But I said that badly, didn't I? This is not a great start. We had a wonderful event at the Bishopsgate Institute all day today on the legacy of the Levellers and the Civil War, on the history that we all experience and the working class struggle that we still learn from that. And without repeating everything that was said there, I just simply say this. My message from that and from everything else is the most important subject our children can learn in school is history, where our rights came from, where the struggles came from, where we've won, and indeed where we've lost, and how we don't have to wait for the rich and powerful to give us things, we have to do it ourselves. That's surely what the level is all about. Speaking of which, it's always nice to be in this particular centre because this centre is the product of a struggle of the Cypriot community in North London, that most of whom came here after the 1974 war, and there was then a huge debate in Haringey about whether we should have ethnically based community centres or not, and I'm pleased to say that the late great Bernie Grant and myself played a role in managing to divert a substantial slice of Haringey Council's capital expenditure into purchasing this building to make it into the Cypriot Centre, and it's still here. Thank you very much for that. As Sam said, austerity is not just about balancing books. It's presented to us as though it's all a matter of good housekeeping and it's just a question of paying off these debts. We've paid off these debts, we can spend money on next year's holiday. It's that, so it's presented like that, and it's not a good idea to borrow on a credit card because you pay more interest, so don't go to a credit card, instead take out a mortgage. You know, it's all very nicely put forward as though it's all just a question of how we look after our own household expenditure. Actually, look behind what is really happening with the process of austerity since 2008. But go back a stage to the austerity that was imposed on Latin American countries in the 1980s, to African countries in the 80s and 1990s, with structural adjustment programs, all of which were predicated on an unsustainable debt that those countries had incurred, usually because of capital expenditure, made worse because of high interest rates, made worse because of that time very high oil prices, and they were told the solution was you have to sell off the state assets because that'll give you lots of money in which you can pay off the debts with, and you've got to reduce the labour costs, so that means you've got to stop all this generous state employment and put people over to the private sector instead. And you've got to stop the idea that you can have siege economies that produce enough food to sustain the local population. And you've got to open yourself up to the market of US agribusiness produced maize in order that we can take over and run your economy. What's the result of all that? Mega cities of desperate poverty in shanty towns around every capital city in Africa as a result of it. What's the result being in Latin America? Broadly similar, except that the process of privatisation went the other way. It went the other way because of the opposition to it. How did Evo Morales become president of Bolivia, other than, initially, leading the coca growers and the fight against water privatisation in Cochabamba in Bolivia? And that had massive consequences, which resulted in the movement towards socialism government in Bolivia, rising living standards, falling levels of inequality, greater expectations of young people, and a massive beacon of hope for people all over that continent and all over the world. You never know what the reaction to these things is. Austerity is now being tried out in Europe, principally, but not exclusively, and to its greatest extent in Greece, Italy and Ireland, but also here and other places. And what's it about? Yes, of course it's about allegedly book balancing in Greece, but it's really about reducing the power of organised labour, reconfiguring society, destroying the social gains, privatising the public services, and setting up a meritocratic, market-orientated society rather than a society based on the idea that everyone has access to health, access to education, access to housing, and access to a welfare system that protects them against destitution, homelessness, and poverty. That surely is something worth fighting for, those things, and not allowing the European Central Bank or the economists that surround them to take that away, because that is what they are trying to do. But there are methods used in promoting this process of austerity, and this is the real danger. The real spectre that's haunting Europe at the moment, behind the financial wizardry that's we're being lectured with all the time, is the growth of xenophobia and the growth of racism and the way in which it divides people. Think for a moment. Last year, 3,000 people drowned in the Mediterranean trying to escape wars and conflict and poverty and destitution in North Africa to get to Europe. Until very recently, it was barely mentioned in the media. The response of the European Union has been to stop the funding of Mare Nostrum, which was the Italian search and rescue operation, and instead produce Frontex, which is a European defence organisation to stop migrants reaching Europe. What has happened to our humanity that we're more bothered about a relatively small number of people getting to a place of safety than we are about the 3,000 that have died and the 300 that have already died this year? That is because many of the political leaders in Europe are frightened of standing up against the xenophobic tide, and they'd rather blame it on these poor and desperate people that are drowning in the Mediterranean. For God's sake, let's have some humanity in what our calculations are and what we do. And just by way of adding to that, there are hundreds of migrants in detention in Britain, under immigration detention centres, indefinitely, very complicated and limited rights of appeal against it. Many of those are now on hunger strike. Surely that is a matter of shame for the whole of the country, that we're detaining people with no obvious route to how they're going to resolve those problems indefinitely, and that's why they've taken hunger strike. There is a human rights crisis that has to be addressed. It cannot be swept away and again ignored because people are frightened of standing up against UKIP and the far right within our society. I will be proud to be in Trafalgar Square on the 21st at that rally, along with all the other rallies that are taking place all across Europe. Don't let them divide us. Stand together as all communities, stand together against racism. We know where the racists end up dividing us in order that the rich and powerful will benefit and divide our society accordingly. So please be there next week if you possibly can in that rally. And I just finish with these quick points because I can feel Matt getting fidgety behind me. I've known him for so long, I know when he gets fidgety. Behave yourself, Matt. The issues that we face. One, in London, the housing crisis. Is there a housing crisis? Or is there a crisis created by the deliberate keeping vacant of very large numbers of quite big properties? The Bishop's Avenue could house several hundred people, and many wouldn't even know they were there with any neighbours because the houses are so big. There'd be no problem there. They could all be used much more usefully than they are at the moment, apart from one, which has apparently been empty for so long, is apparently worth several £1 million, this house, but whoever owns it doesn't want to put anybody in there because that would reduce the value. But it's become a very good home for owls, foxes and badgers. So at least somebody's living there, and I hope they remain happily living there. But the housing crisis is really a crisis of lack of supply of council housing, of a government housing policy that makes it difficult, if not impossible, for councils to build housing, and forces housing associations into seeking funding from the private sector. Therefore, they're building more houses for commercial rent and for sale rather than the social rent levels they ought to be. and an almost completely unregulated private rented sector where the obscenity of rent levels of former council flats now reaching £500 and £600 a week. What's the result of that? The social cleansing of the poor and those on benefits and those on low wages who require support through the benefit system out of central London, indeed out of London altogether. We are socially cleansing London by this whole housing process. And so I am absolutely determined that, as in this Parliament I've tried in the next Parliament, we are not just going to regulate the private rented sector, we're going to control the rents in the private rented sector as well to stop this obscene level of profiteering and, in reality, state subsidy of that. On the health service, I supported the NHS reinstatement bill that a whole lot of us put forward to the House of Commons this week. It was presented by Caroline Lucas and supported by a large number of MPs from all parties except the Conservatives and I think the Lib Dems. I'm pretty sure the Lib Dems didn't support it. There was one. Okay, I take it back. I apologise. I'm sorry.
He's the rebel.
Father, forgive me, I have sinned. Okay, but it was supported by a number. And there are many, many issues surrounding that. But in reality, there are lots of campaigns. There's campaigns on housing, there's campaigns on legal aid, there's campaigns on justice, access to justice, there's campaigns on so many things. I support all those campaigns because they all bring more people together. I thought a wonderful day was when I stood outside the Ministry of Justice and the police told us all that we shouldn't really be there, and I pointed out this police officer who was sort of rather gently moaning and complaining about it. He ought to be really careful because there was 1,000 lawyers in front of him taking part in the demonstration, and I was quite sure a few of those knew something about the law. So I thought the joy or the success of a Tory government in getting 1,000 lawyers demonstrating outside the Ministry of Justice is something to behold. And so the next Parliament is going to be different and interesting. I have no idea what the election result's going to be any more than anybody else has in this room, except it's unlikely any party will have an overall majority. That means our activity before the election matters because it raises the issues and raises the demands and puts the pressure on every candidate. It also means that we're in a position to make those demands. And there are many we have to make. I know this isn't the main subject of today's debate and discussion, but there was a workshop on it. First of all, why on earth are we as a society even countenancing spending £100 billion on replacing a Trident nuclear missile system to create our very own weapons of mass destruction? And so we are promised there's going to be a strategic defence review in the next Parliament. Fine, I'm happy to take part in that. But I think we should have a foreign policy review first and start directing our foreign policy towards human rights, environmental protection and justice rather than invasion wars and pleasing the USA and accepting NATO spending targets. There is a different way of looking at the world rather than one war after another after another. Then there are the many issues that we've mentioned on housing, health and social justice issues, but there is also, and that came up in the workshop, one very, very key one, and that is the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Now, this is being presented as though if only you could write out the bits that affect the National Health Service, it's okay because it's just a bit more trade and there's going to be, depending on which particularly optimistic economists you listen to, there's either going to be 1 million more jobs, 5 million more jobs, 10 million more jobs, 20 million more jobs, 200 million more jobs, 500 million more jobs, 1,000 million more jobs, 1 billion million more jobs. It just goes on and on. You ask anyone, what's the result? They said it's going to be really good. Where do you get these figures from? How do you calculate any of this? The reality of TTIP is it is secret negotiations between officials in the US and officials in the European Union with global corporations in the room deciding what powers they want over national government, what powers they want to prosecute governments for allegedly not protecting their investments. And if you think this is fanciful talk, that a corporation can take a government to court, I'll give you a few examples. The government of Australia, hardly the world's most revolutionary left-wing government by any means, taken to court over tobacco. The government of Poland, taken to court. The government of Venezuela taken to court. The government of Argentina taken to court. Tanzania being taken to court. So many more, where vultures have bought up debts and now trying to extract the remains of those debts from the government. Are we really going to allow TTIP to go through, which will give power to an investor protection committee dominated by the interests of global corporations to destroy the social gains that many countries have made on both sides of the Atlantic? Are we really going to allow labour standards to be the lowest common denominator anywhere in any of the European countries, Canada, USA or Mexico? I think you'll find the worst conditions are probably the state of Alabama in the USA, although it's a tight competition for that bargain basement slot. So let's ensure that people do understand what the dangers of TTIP are and make sure that that, along with many, many other issues, are the specific questions put to candidates in the election. I just conclude with this. We're having the rally against austerity in June, 20th of June. Very, very important to get a huge attendance there. There's also those great labour movement events over the summer. The Durham Miners' Gala in July. The Tolpuddle Martyrs Festival also in July. There's those occasions. After the election, we make the demands. No privatisation in the NHS. End to the bedroom tax. Control of private rents. End to TTIP and the threat that goes with it. Not spending money on nuclear weapons. All those demands, credible, real, definite, and those demands, successful, will make a real difference to the lives of the poorest people in this country. Make a real difference to those people that are currently being told their problem is somebody down the road. Their problem is an older person, a younger person, a person in a different country, or so on. No. Through our history, we achieve change by people working together to achieve a national health service, to achieve a welfare state, all those great achievements. That is the alliance, the community, the coalition that will defend what we've got, but above all, raise our horizons so that poverty is eliminated, can be eliminated, and we don't live in a world of war, we live in a world of peace. It just means we've all got to get together and stay together to achieve it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeremy. That's it for today. But please join us at Downing Street, 6 p.m. this Wednesday, for the People's Assembly against austerity protests against the budget. 6 p.m. this Wednesday.